5:21 to order. The first item on our agenda is the minutes of our previous meeting from 5:24 of 2021, copies of which are in the meeting packets. Any revisions or corrections to the minutes necessary? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Motion by Herbst, is there a second? Do we have a second to approve the minutes? Second by Peckham. Further discussion or questions? Members in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Aye, opposed? None are opposed. Minutes are approved.
Lisa, can I have an opportunity to bring up a point of order?
Certainly.
If I'm correct, Leslie, the members of the Park Committee as set forth on the website are Pat Peckham, Lou Larson, Tom Killian, Sarah Watson, and Tom Neal. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, yes.
Well, that would mean we have a unnoticed quorum of the Parks Committee here, and that would be a violation of the open meetings law because this meeting was only agendized and noticed for the Public Health and Safety Committee. So we have somebody might have to go. Not you. You have to be here for the quorum of this meeting.
Jim wants to volunteer.
So I'll let the three Parks members decide what they want to do. Under open meetings law, any quorum of a body that could potentially act would be a violation of the open meetings law unless that meeting was also noticed.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it to the members of that committee.
Do you want to take a minute and let them go out and talk about what they want to do? Or?
Well, it's up to you guys. I mean,
If it would please the chair, we could do that
Well,
and
we
make
need-
it expedient.
well, but Pat's on the committee, so we
Yes.
need him for sure.
Yes.
And it's
So-
not like they can't watch on the web or something, it's live, so,
Well, and we actually are planning for you to present, so you should be here.
Yeah, I wouldn't think you would want to go.
So,
And Pat can't go or we
It's up-
lose the
it's-
quorum.
Could
so
I
guess it's-
comment
you
as a
guys-
citizen then?
Well, you're still here as a quorum. You can't be here as a quorum, is my understanding of the open meetings rules. That's just a problem.
So can we turn on the, if he leaves the room, can we turn on the video in one of the other rooms? Or is it specifically the building?
I don't know. This
Just
is
forget it,
sort
I'm
of
out of here. okay?
surprised me, and I didn't have any chance to kind of research, how big the room can be.
I did a lot of research on this meeting tonight, and I'm awful disappointed that this has happened.
This is still going to be, you
Because
guys.
this is very, very important, not only for me, but the community out here.
You asked for this also to be on the Parks agenda, so this will also be coming to Parks.
And why is it, that was my question, why is this, all our environmental issues have gone to parks, and why
No.
is it coming to this
Park-
committee?
The Park Committee has jurisdiction over park land, but this resolution has broad application beyond parkland, and the Liberation and Freedom Committee this spring voted by majority to send the item here. So we have it here, and we agreed with that committee that we would give it fair consideration when it was ready.
So we're gonna be able to talk about it at the Parks and Rec meeting, but we're not gonna be able to vote on it, so.
Well, it's on for discussion, but it's beyond the jurisdiction of that committee.
Well, and you have an opportunity to amend the agenda for Parks. I don't believe it's gone out. If you all, Pat is the chair, if he wants to amend that agenda or send it out for discussion or possible action. I mean, it was suggested as a possibility that this be a joint meeting between the two committees, and that was rejected.
So we run afoul of the law if the content of this meeting could influence the action of the Park and Rec Committee. We would be in violation of Wisconsin open meetings.
I mean, if you guys want to take turns, one go and then text, come back, I mean, that, and then another one leave.
No,
that
I
could
realize
work.
how important this is to Alder Killian, so I will bow out. But let me go to put this on record, I will bowing out, not very happy.
Okay, well, this committee didn't make the law. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I'm just sorry, because in all honesty, Madam Chair, I have a problem with you chairing this committee because of what happened at the last council meeting with the last resolution, and I don't want to make sure, these resolutions are important to these people and this community. And what happened at the last council meeting, the resolution got squashed. And I don't want that to happen to this resolution because it is equally as important to this community as the last resolution.
Well,
And with that, I'm out of here.
sorry you feel that way.
Well, and you could have advised Leslie, because we could have amended the agenda up to 24 hours before, so I had no
Okay,
idea
well, let's
who
get
all
on
was
with
going to be here.
let's get on with the work of the committee.
Other than Tom, I assumed.
Okay, and so.
That's Alderperson Killian, but yes, that's correct.
Okay, so let's get on with our agenda. The meeting is legally posted as a committee meeting of this committee, and we have a quorum present that can take action, so we're going to go forward. Item number 2 is discussion and possible action on a resolution to support environmental justice considered and recommended by the Liberation and Freedom Committee. And you'll note from your packets that a few months ago, the Liberation and Freedom Committee began discussion of this item to support environmental justice. And they had a presentation in that committee from Alder Killian. At that time, the legal department had asked for some revisions to that draft. He has made those revisions. And so at that point then, I felt it was certainly time for this committee to take up the discussion that was requested by Liberation and Freedom. So what we have before us is the version of the resolution that includes his changes. So with that, I guess what I want to do first is give Alder Killian a chance to explain the origins of this ordinance and its implication. He's done a volume of research on it, and so I want to give him the same opportunity that he had in the other two committees, the Environmental and Sustainability Commission and Liberation and Freedom, because a number of our members have not been involved in those discussions to date. So Alder Killian, could you just walk us through how we got here?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Well, environmental history at the environmental justice at the federal level has a long history, and it was under the George H.W. Bush administration that the Office of Environmental Equity was started, which later became the Office of Environmental Justice. And this has trickled down, I think as many of us know, perhaps all of us here, to state agencies and other federal agencies as well through various federal executive orders and other items. And the objective of environmental justice approaches and policies are to do what was recognized and to mitigate what was recognized under the Bush administration. And what was recognized was that incidentally or not, and historically it was often incidental, but that did not reduce the significance of the impact, that statistically and factually we saw two segments that were disproportionately burdened by environmental consequences, and that those were low-income residents or low-wealth areas and people of color. So what we see is a statistical and factual pattern, not just across the country, but as the MPO has identified in this area with transportation programs and so forth. We've also seen disparate consequences with those segments in this area and in the city of Wausau. And I've provided some references that I would like to touch on briefly. But the EPA, when it began its environmental justice work, in order to address those disproportionate burdens to these segments, it set out with really two objectives in mind, and that was the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards. That would be one. And the second was equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. So that is why it is not simply about equal protections from environmental hazards and equal access to environmental assets. The public participation processes, as we can see at the federal and state level, at the state level through WIS-DOT, I've got an example of their framework. The public participation processes are an integral component of environmental justice, and that is the reason it is in the resolution. And and perhaps I can save some time to address things that come up, so I won't go on an epic summary right now. But locally, I think many residents and local representatives know that there are certain areas of town, and this is where I think reality is apparent, and it's not just theoretical. There are certain areas and census blocks and so forth in town that have borne a disproportionate burden of environmental impacts, and we can see that on the southwest side. For example, since 2019, there have been, I believe, 5 new DNR ERP sites in the entire city of Wausau, and 3 of those were in a 1 to 2 block radius in the Thomas Street neighborhood, which is roughly 60%. Now, based on EPA EJ screen data in those nearby and surrounding areas, as you can see in the reference I handed out, there are areas of that neighborhood that are nearly 50% low income and 50% people of color. And again, I think as the chair has mentioned in the past, these things have been discussed a lot, so I won't go on a nuanced history of some of the environmental and health impacts there. But I will bring up one more area of the city just to show you that it's not really isolated to one neighborhood, and that would be the area near downtown and around the former Wausau chemical site. So as the EPA Superfund documents show and the public health assessments and so forth, when you look at the demographic data in that area historically, we can see the same trend. In fact, in Wausau Daily Herald articles, parents begged the state health department to come back and do the health study it said it would do regarding that Superfund site because children were getting leukemia and they were very worried about it. Now, DHS on multiple occasions gave these families their word that they would in fact come and perform that follow-up study. Unfortunately, I had confirmed with their office in Madison probably 2 years ago that never materialized. So I think that as mentioned at other meetings, yes, there's federal and state oversight and there are regulators, but I think we see through all policy realms that there is an integration among these different levels, and we see that in many policy buckets. So in conclusion, the language of this, just so the committee and public is aware, came 99%, the original version, from a resolution that was passed in Evanston, Illinois, roughly a year ago, and the city council had passed that unanimously there, although in Wisconsin, I believe this would be one of the first municipal level resolutions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, and yes, stay close because we may have questions for you after we get further into the meat of it. We do have a number of community members that have registered to speak this evening. At this point, we'll take public comment respective to this item. And at that point, then, once we've completed public comment, we then will confer with advisory staff and then open a discussion between the committee members about this item as well. So with that, the folks that we have registered tonight, there are about 10 of you. I would like to start with Gary Gisselman. We'll bring him up first. He's registered to speak, and we'll go down the list from there. Each person will have one turn at the microphone. State your name and address for the record, and we'll allow you 3 minutes to say anything you need to say.
I didn't think I would be this quick, Lisa.
So welcome back.
Thank you. Gary Gisselman, 319 Park Avenue, Wausau, Wisconsin.
Welcome.
I urge you to move this resolution on to the city council. As a past representative of the Wausau Chemical neighborhood, I think that the neighborhoods in this community have undergone a lot of stress, and I think that this resolution commits the city of Wausau to finally, with one voice, start to move forward in recognizing in a large scale the pollution that has been going on mostly along the riverfront for over 150 years. And I think that this resolution points us in a direction, and in a direction of becoming aware of the situation with regard to past contamination and with regard to the situation that Mr. Killian emphasized again, that these are neighborhoods that are poor, that maybe have not as sufficient input into the decisions as we have wished in the past. My neighborhood is still very close to like I said, to the Wausau chemical site, still undergoing scrutiny. So I think that this points us in a direction of going forth into a good way of letting the citizens of the city know that the city council is aware of the situation and wants to make things right. So with that, I thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Next up, we'll bring up Bruce Grau.
Bruce Grau, 1115 North 10th Street. Even before the 1937 city-imposed order mandating children to stay in their homes due to an unrelenting release of quartz dust emanating from the 3M plant, Wausonians have been under the assault of industrial polluters. Over 40 identified polluted sites downtown have undergone cleanup, but continue to exude residual contamination. Currently, there are 10 active sites downtown and in several neighborhoods. Dry cleaner solvent and petroleum chemical breakdown products, PCBs with and without dioxin, PAHs, PFOs, PFAs, arsenic, thallium, mercury, rock powder, deadly, deforming, debilitating toxins found in the air, the soil, in groundwater being funneled through leaky pipes, and into our Wisconsin River. 143 plaintiffs filed suit in response to 6 deaths and damages to health and property values due to long-term exposure of multiple pollutants from the Crestline site. The exposure has historically been most concentrated in working class, poor, and diverse neighborhoods as they surround the polluting sites. The last 5 identified sites have all been in such neighborhoods. In District 3, the area most affected, the population is at least 23% people of color, and 47% of the residents in that area live below poverty level. Census Tract 1 downtown is the highest percentage of disabled people in the city. Environmental justice facilitates the active participation of those historically impacted the worst, but least likely to engage with the power structure. Cynicism abounds that the city represents only the wealthy and powerful. Skepticism exists that one's marginalized experience will not be understood by such a homogenized appearing city government. There's fear of possible retribution if someone steps forward to criticize the system, and many feel the committee is not for them. By endorsing the environmental justice resolution, the city is declaring it acknowledges the disproportional effect long-standing pollution has had on poor, working-class Wausonians of color and disabled people. It endorses the conviction that addressing the needs of the most impacted leads to the benefit of all Wausonians, as pollution will be controlled close to their sites of origin. It commits to incorporate the impact of all major policy decisions on the most underrepresented residents. It commits to extending its outreach to our underrepresented residents through persistent effort using the most effective means available. And it commits to monitor the level of engagement and perception of quality of life measures of all our residents on a regular basis through citywide surveys. Thank you.
I have to assume that was the end of your clock there? It was pretty loud. I didn't even have my microphone on, it was that loud. Next up on our list is Rita Pockel.
Hello, Rita Pockel, 1310 Maple Hill Road. These are things I live by. If you make a mess or a mistake, clean it up or fix it. One person is not better than another, but just as good, no matter the economic status, culture, gender, sexual orientation, or skin color. Our whiteness does not make us better or more deserving. I point out several facts. I would not like to live in or next to a brownfield area. I believe you would not want to do it either. Air pollution, PFAS, and other such chemicals do not stay in one area because you put a fence around it. I add this. We need this resolution for environmental justice because it puts it in writing. Then in years to come, people will not misquote or misunderstand the issue. Passing the resolution will be a shining example of Wausau's goodness and inconclusiveness for all of our Wausonians. Adopting the resolution is the right thing to do, and I look forward to your vote.
Thank you for that. Next on our list is Terry Killian.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Terry Killian. I live at 133 East Thomas Street in the city of Wausau, and I'm very proud to say I'm a co-spokesperson for Citizens for a Clean Wausau. Citizens for a Clean Wausau strongly supports the environmental justice resolution before you this evening, and CCW has strongly supported environmental justice efforts in this city in the past. Over the years, and very successfully, CCW has worked on various pollution and contamination matters in diverse working-class neighborhoods in Wausau, and we, as probably you, have seen the profound impact which environmental burdens can place on the lives of our residents. Tonight before us is a very positive opportunity and one which would be a win for both city government and the community that it serves. The facts and common sense, and I'm going to repeat that, the facts and common sense tells us there is no downside to this resolution. There's only an upside for our people. CCW is not going to stop its pursuit for environmental justice in the city of Wausau until environmental justice is achieved in a real and meaningful way. Tonight could be that positive step forward in which the people and the government take that step together, as it should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Next on our list, Randy Radke.
Hi, my name is Randy Radke. I reside at 244 Wyatt Street, Wausau, Wisconsin. I want to voice my support on the environmental justice resolution. I feel with the ugly history of environmental contamination in Wausau, I feel this resolution will be a step forward to a more brighter, cleaner, and positive future for our city. I hope this committee and our city council votes to pass this resolution. Thanks for letting me speak tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Next on our agenda on our list to speak is Lisa Ort Sodergaard.
Thank you, everyone, for being here and allowing me to speak tonight. I just want to make a correction, Madam Chairperson. My name is Lisa Ort Sondergaard. Okay. It's a tough name to say and even tougher to spell for some people. In any event, I reside at 220180 Pleasant Drive in Edgar. You might wonder why someone from Edgar would care about a City of Wausau resolution. I will explain that very quickly. I am a retired social worker. I spent 12 years in the Wausau School District. One of my elementary schools that I served was G.D. Jones, which is in the Thomas Street area. I got to know those families very well. I was in many of their homes. I helped them and held their hand and all kinds of things through some of the toughest moments in their life. And so I feel a very strong affinity to the city of Wausau, primarily that area. I'm not going to cite a bunch of statistics because I think that Alderman Killian has done a good job of that in his packet information, and I think the resolution states a lot of the facts and reasons that we need this resolution. I'm going to repeat what one of the earlier speakers says about common sense. I'm not going to cite facts, but I'm going to talk to you about common sense, and I'm going to speak to you from my heart. What I know as a retired social worker and as an informed citizen is that the environment has impact on all of us. Our air, our water, our soil impacts our health. It impacts our ability to make a living. It impacts our emotional and our behavioral life. As a school social worker, I saw a lot of kids with behavioral problems. Now, I can't always say those came from environmental reasons. I also can't say that they didn't. Because the other thing that I know about our poor families, and there are a number of poor families here in Wausau, is that they have limited choices. They can't always choose where they're going to live. If they own a home in a neighborhood that may not be considered as desirable by those of us with more affluence, they can't necessarily sell and move. Our elderly may not be able to leave a neighborhood because they don't have the resources, the financial resources to leave either. This leaves a lot of people, a lot of poor people, not being homeowners, but people who rent. Oftentimes, rental property is in the less desirable neighborhoods in terms of those of us with affluence. They have less choices. They also oftentimes don't have health care. So when they or their children are exhibiting emotional or social or behavioral or physical symptoms, they may not go to the doctor to find out if there's a reason for that, probably because they can't afford to. They're also less likely to come to a situation like this and speak out on their behalf. They feel less powerful in our community. They oftentimes feel marginalized or stigmatized. And practically speaking, a lot of times they're working 2 or 3 jobs to support their families. So coming to a city council committee meeting at 5:15 just isn't in some people's life plan. It just isn't. So I'm urging you to advocate for those who can't come and those who may have been impacted, probably are impacted by environmental hazards. Please pass this resolution. This is the right thing to do. It's the humane thing to do, and it makes economic sense. Because if our citizens are healthy, we are less likely to need more jails, less likely to need more special education resources. It just makes good sense for Wausau, besides just being the right thing to do as a human being. So thank you for your support.
Thank you for that. Next on our list is Don Lewandowski.
My name is Don Lewandowski, and I reside at 174514 Mission Lake Road in Hatley. My wife and I own multiple rental properties in the city of Wausau. So I'm here to speak as, I guess I just have one question. You can answer it later maybe. Why would you not pass this resolution? What are you afraid of? What's the downside? It's really just a commitment to all the citizens of Wausau saying that you're serious about fighting environmental issues in the city. So all I want to say is I don't know why you wouldn't pass it. Thanks.
Thank you. Next on our list is Joyce Litkey.
Good afternoon. I am here as an advocate and supporter for the resolution to support environmental justice. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This is according to the EPA. The city of Wausau is committed to this goal. Here are some quotes from the Mobilize Green website. Environmental equity versus environmental justice. What's the difference? In the resolution, it talks about both. Environmental equity describes a country or world in which no single group or community faces disadvantages in dealing with environmental hazards, disasters, or pollution. Environmental equity is a basic human right. According to the EPA, fair treatment means that no single sect of the population should be disproportionately affected by environmental crisis as a result of laws or policies. I'm sorry, I get so nervous when I have to speak. Meaningful involvement means that groups like ours and the citizens can offer input regarding decisions that affect their health or their environment. This involvement also means that my input and the other people who are here tonight to speak will be taken seriously and considered when making said decisions. If environmental equity is a basic right, environmental justice is the act of protecting that right. Equity is the outcome of environmental justice. Equity is not achieved without justice. As a concerned citizen, I ask the Public Health and Safety Committee to live up to its name, Public Health and Safety Committee, and mission, and pass the resolution to support environmental justice. The environmental justice resolution is a positive step. It's positive to every single person in this area to address key components of both the natural environment and equity, which leads to a community's quality of life and livability, as stated in the resolution. I don't know how much time I have to.
You're almost there. You're at 3 right now.
Okay. I was going to give a quick example of equity, and that would be the button to get into the building, because so many people who are in wheelchairs weren't able to get into the building. So my address, I don't know if I mentioned that, 3605 Cross Point Boulevard, apartment 371 Weston. And thank you so much for allowing us to speak.
Sure.
And all that you do.
Thank you. Next on our list is Chris Northley.
My name is Chris Northley. Most of you know me. Kind of got into this with Tom purposely because environmental justice for me, it starts with the monopoly of input, the monopolization of who has a say, whose word is heard, the equity in people feeling comfortable with participating in their own process and the governance of their own city starts with participation. And over my history here, I believe the number of people of color that has grown of participation in this city has almost been none. The same people participate, the same people come speak. And that in itself says somebody don't feel comfortable with coming to their city and participating either for or against. Environmental justice isn't a set decision. It's about people feeling comfortable to express themselves. And it does no good, and this is the truth, it does no good to write things that you're not going to live up to in the first place. At the end of the day, at 54, I've witnessed policymakers write things and not live up to it. The greatest commitment comes to, are you going to live up to the things you write? Because otherwise, we go back to the sentimental and the anemic. And how do we get more people to participate in the things that's going to ultimately affect their lives? We must say the words equity. We must use the words monopoly. We must use the word disparity. It's obvious. It's glaring. But it's not as if it's something that can't be confronted and dealt with. At the end of the day, we would hope that we're all humans and not just our ethnicity. We would hope that we're all citizens and not just our struggle. The greatest city is those that join together to overcome and not just exacerbate something, because ultimately it's the people who get hurt, the people who are not here, the people who got to live with our decisions and our words. So I hope that even though I'm hoping you pass this, I'm hoping you're ready to commit to live it more than just say it and give us something to feel good about. All right, thank you.
Thank you for that. Next on our list, Jack Hogendijk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Jack Hogendijk. I live on Hilltop Road in the city of Wausau, and apologize if my remarks may not be very well prepared. I usually try to take a little more time to do that, but heard about this on short notice. Just a couple of thoughts that I have, Madam Chair. If this resolution is about cleaning up the environment, cleaning up Wausau, I guess I would say that first let's look at the history over the last 60 to 70 years. A great deal of cleanup of the environment of this community has already been done. And we have the force of law at the federal level, at the state level, and probably at the local level, that if anyone is still polluting or still needs to clean up something that they made, we have the laws in place to get that done. I don't see how this resolution is going to help make that happen any more quickly or any more effectively. But I do have concerns about many of the clauses in the resolution. There's this whole discussion again about equity, and apparently this resolution is using a definition of equity that came from the president in his executive order from a few months ago, where he says that equity is defined by the 2021 executive order on advancing racial equity and support for undeserved communities through the federal government means the consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals. Well, that sounds kind of good on the face of it, but the question is, what does that really going to mean? If this becomes eventually a force of law, does that mean that something will be taken away from some and given to others in order to level the playing field, in order to make it equitable for all? And I do think, and I would assume that you're going to have discussion on this, we should probably listen closely to the concerns that came from the Director of Public Works and Utilities, who wrote a rather lengthy document with citing his concerns, and he summarized by saying it would be helpful to understand from the governing body where the priorities lie, what challenges the council feels need to be addressed, and what needs to be improved, and what is the overall objective of this type of resolution. And then further, the assistant city attorney expressed some serious concerns as well as to what the impact would be of this resolution and whether or not there could be legal action taken place or litigation that would result from this. I think that the problems that are in front of us can be addressed with existing laws. I don't see why we would need a resolution like this in order to get that done. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Last up on our registered commenters is Will Harris.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Chair and Public Health and Safety Committee. My name is William Harris. My address is 316 and a half North 3rd Street, Apartment C, Wausau, Wisconsin. And I am currently the Marathon County Board Supervisor for District 3. I will try to be brief. I am here to urge the committee's support for the Environmental Justice Resolution. Environmental justice is about ensuring every person's right to a healthy and safe place to live and work, and freedom from environmental hazards. However, it is no secret that if you are part of a marginalized population, underserved population, socioeconomic status, especially, has often played a role in where people live and, unfortunately, what they're exposed to, and in their ability to live in a safe place. Now, I think on a basic level, we understand that we all want and need to live where our ground, water, and air are safe, and impacts on the environment do play a huge impact on our health. And realizing that, we realize why there are so many health disparities, especially in economically depressed communities. As Alderperson Killian states, there are areas here that are largely impacted, areas where typically there are low income. So as a city, we do have a responsibility to promote and ensure the health and safety of all our citizens. And we should have no problem in wanting to ensure that for everyone, if truly we say that's what we're about. And that includes underserved, marginalized, and low-income populations. So please support this resolution. It is the right thing to do. And it does benefit the city in terms of health, our economy, and in our future. We all want to succeed here in this city, and I urge that you support that so that we all have the opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. That was the last of our registered public commenters. Do we have anybody that showed up late that did not have a chance to register that would like to offer any public comment? Okay, come on up.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the chance to speak. So my name is Kahlo, and I live at 620 and a half Lincoln Avenue. I'm just here to urge the committee to vote to pass the environmental justice resolution. I think, it's a really good move for the city to make that statement that we are committed to cleaning up the pollution and, and making sure that residents of the city of Wausau are protected against these pollutions. One thing that there's been a lot of talk about, what do we do after this resolution if it does pass? And 4 days ago, the EPA announced $50 million to fund environmental justice initiatives under the American Rescue Plan. And it's millions of dollars, and I don't think that the city of Wausau would want to miss out on that money so that we can clean up, some parts of Wausau. And I'm glad to see that my former alderman, Mr. Gilselman, was here as well, and Mr. Lewandowski is my current alderman. And some of you may know that I'm also County Board Supervisor for District 5. District 5, Ward 13 does come along right, by that river. And, Wausau Chemical is another, area of that district where I'm very concerned about as well, just like Mr. Gilselman. So I'm hoping that, the resolution does pass and, we can address, keeping our residents safe. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That should conclude public comment at this point then. The next step in our discussion, I think, is the committee will consult with its staff advisors. The first staff advisor we have to come up is our environmental professional, Kevin Fable, if you'd like to come up and talk with the committee. In the packets, you'll note that we do have some comment in Director Lindman's memo from you, Kevin, but I guess if you'd like to walk us through your review of this resolution and, you know, I guess clarify for us your comments from the report.
First off, I guess I'll go through the statement I have in your packets and just want to go through phrase by phrase just to clarify or explain the statements in there. I'll read the statement, and at certain points of the statement, I'll explain what that phrase meant. I, as environmental engineer for the city of Wausau for the past 8+ years, am aware of 0 instances during that time or any time previous where minority groups or low-income areas have shouldered any additional burden or have been disproportionately affected by environmental consequences. I guess that first phrase means that I personally, in the areas of my responsibility as environmental engineer, I have been aware of 0 instances where minority groups or low-income individuals were discriminated against or treated unfairly, or any inequity, I guess is probably the word, where environmental laws and cleanup occurred that where the minority groups or the low-income areas were discriminated against. They have been disproportionately affected by environmental consequences as the result of any environmental violations in any of the issues or areas I've been involved with. When we do have environmental violations through permits, state and federal law dictates how we have to address those. The city doesn't have the discretion of saying, well, this is a low-income area, this is a minority area, so we're going to treat that area differently. State and federal law dictates that you treat everyone the same. State and federal law also dictates that there is equity required there because you're not allowed to have preferential treatment when it comes to environmental responsibilities, laws, and cleanup. So I don't want to speak for anyone, but it seems that this resolution almost infers that in the past there's been discrimination on the city's part when it comes to low-income areas or minority areas, and I just want to clarify that the city does not have that option. That state and federal law dictates that you're not allowed to do that. Not that the city ever would, but at the same time, your state and federal law dictates that cannot occur. So in other words, I am aware of no environmental injustices which would require a new environmental justice policy to correct, repair, or make good on in the city of Wausau. And just a couple other points as people were speaking earlier. I guess when I was doing this statement, and maybe the wording is, I don't know about the wording, the word justice is the word I'm kind of struggling with, because when I hear environmental justice, I think of justice in the criminal sense where if a crime was committed, justice needs to be done to either punish someone punitively or make good on who was affected by the crime to punish the perpetrator. And as the people have commented tonight, it seems like they're focused on we want to clean up pollution, we want clean air, we want clean water, we want clean soil, and I think everyone in this room would agree with that, as well as everyone in the city. But environmental justice, to me, has a different meaning. Environmental justice means punishment and punitive. And so just by saying that you want to, just by saying that you want to have clean air, clean water, clean soil, seems to be disconnected with an environmental justice resolution. And then I guess lastly, just one point, someone had brought up the fact of, in the past few years, the number of ERP or brownfield sites, and those sites being in the Thomas Street area. And to me, that says we are not doing what the environmental justice resolution accuses the city of. If we have ERP sites, that means we're cleaning up pollution. That means we're focusing resources on areas such as the Thomas Street site that would be considered as the low-income area. Is that how it was described, or?
It was described as the MPO described it, which was a formally identified environmental justice population.
Okay. So with that definition, I guess I would just say that because there are the number of ERP sites there, it shows that the city already is directing resources for cleanup. Federal and state law dictate how brownfield sites need to be cleaned up. And the city has in the past, and in the very recent past, put those resources towards those MPO areas in order to clean those up. So, so back to the statement, if the city was aware of brownfield sites and the city had made a decision not to put those resources towards cleaning those up because it was a low-income or a minority area, then that to me would be an environmental injustice. But the fact that the city identifies, and when they do identify these areas, has dedicated the resources to clean these areas up, and has held the RP, the responsible party, by state and federal law to be protective of the environment and the surrounding community and the immediate neighbors of that RP site. The RPs are cleaning these sites up as dictated by state and federal law, and the city's part in that. The city doesn't have jurisdiction to tell the RP how to clean the site up. The city has the resources, if they're the RP, to pay for the cleanup or the resources. But the state and federal government regulate how the RP cleans the site up. So I don't understand how this environmental justice resolution would lead to any cleaner air, water, or soil in the city of Wausau. And if there are areas that do need to be cleaned up, in my experience, the city of Wausau has acted very fair, very equitable with all the citizens, and have not shown preferential treatment or anything that would require a resolution to say that that should be done.
Okay, thank you for that. I guess I have one question, and then we'll see if we have questions also from committee members. With regard to the new and current ERP sites for the DNR, that was one question I was going to ask when that was brought up, is a lot of that the result of ongoing advocacy from citizen groups like Citizen for Clean Wausau and redevelopment efforts to clean areas up? I mean, obviously, as a city, we spent $8 million to move Wausau Chemical away from the river, where previously it had sat for a generation, a stone's throw from the water. You know, when that project was proposed, economically, when we talked about the fact that a chemical plant was mere feet from the water, some of those concerns by folks that didn't want those dollars to be spent was that it wasn't a big deal and that it was a boon for the taxpayers. So, but at the end of the day, I think, and it's not a bad thing. I think advocacy. I think when advocacy groups call attention to a problem and that problem gets addressed, that's ultimately a positive. So the new sites that have been identified that are being worked on, I guess I see that as a positive. But the question I have is, given that, do we already have, and you talked about the city's jurisdiction, do we already have the proper mechanism in place to work with DNR and EPA standards to get them to intervene when they need to? So, when there's a site, when we become aware of pollution on a site, obviously we don't get to dictate how and when the cleanup happens and to what standard it happens. Do you have the appropriate tools already to engage the people who do? That's a key. I want us to have the tools in our toolbox that we need to create accountability when we need to create it, but, do you already have that?
Yes.
Okay.
And to expand on that, The city, as you mentioned, when we identify pollution, the city doesn't have a choice. The city, by state law, must notify DNR of the test results, the site, the contamination levels, and all that information gets submitted to DNR. DNR then reviews that, and then DNR takes control and then dictates to the responsible party is, when there's contamination found, there's a responsible party identified. It's either the entity that caused the pollution, or if that entity is out of business, it's the current owner of the site. So each contaminated site has a responsible party associated with it. Once the contamination is identified, the DNR identifies who the responsible party is and then dictates to the responsible party what steps they have to take to get it A, cleaned up, and B, in a state where the community is protected from the contamination that exists.
Well, and so then in a number of these sites, within these areas, I just seen recently that the DNR requested that 3M, as an example, was mandated to do a better job of cleanup near Sherman Street. Obviously, we're not involved in that process, but it was a very public process to say they weren't satisfied with the plan to clean up whatever needed to be cleaned up. And in the past, they've reviewed plans from entities like Waleco and to make sure that they were holding up their end of the bargain to remediate to the extent that they were mandated. Does any of this give us extra tools to create that accountability beyond the tools we already have? I guess I'm not looking to create redundancies, but we need to determine if what we have works.
Yeah, there's a process on the state level, or in certain instances, the federal level, where when the RP, 3M in that case, is identified, they are required to submit a plan on how they're going to further investigate the contamination that exists, and how, once that's identified, the first step is to identify where the contamination is across the site, and then how deep it goes down. And there's a certain number of samples that you have to take to get to that level of understanding. So the plan that is initially submitted shows the initial results, and then DNR can ask for additional samples to be taken to identify where the contamination is. And then once you get to that point on a site, then the contamination, a plan would be put in place to either A, remove the contamination, contain the contamination, and in all instances, be protective of the public as far as that contamination, so the public isn't affected by it.
Okay. Committee members, do you have any questions for Kevin? Go ahead, Pat.
Yeah, Kevin, in your experience, say in the last 5 to 8 years or something like that, it seems like 4 or 5 years ago, the DNR was somewhat aware of certain areas along that Thomas Street corridor where there was contamination in the soil or in the groundwater, but they were not acting, and the reason they weren't acting, despite the fact that the citizens were pushing for it and they couldn't understand why they weren't, was the statement on their end that they couldn't be sure that they could ascertain who the responsible party was or where the contamination had come from. And it sat that way for quite a few years, but I'm wondering if it's your experience that that has improved and they are being more willing to step up and look into these things.
Just to answer your question, there always is a responsible party. If it isn't the person or business who initially caused the contamination, it defaults to the current owner of the property. So there would never be a situation where, if contamination was identified, that there wouldn't be a responsible party. It would either be the entity that caused the contamination or whoever the current owner of the property was at that time. So that, in answer to your question, Alderman Peckham, it seems unlikely that DNR not acting, it would not be for the lack of a responsible party, because there always is one.
Maybe instead of a responsible party, ability to prove where that junk came from. And it almost seemed like there were instances where, you know, they were on one piece of property adjacent to, say, Waleco, and contaminants that were obviously at Waleco were found on the adjacent property. But it seemed like the DNR was reluctant to act and saying, well, we can't really prove that that's where it came from. Well, sorry, but duh.
What might have, and I don't know if this is exactly the case, but if you own a piece of property and you find contamination on it, you're responsible for it, unless you can prove that another entity caused that contamination. So what DNR might have been advising is that if, let's say you owned a piece of property next to a certain site, when you start investigating your property, if you find contamination on it, you're the responsible party unless you can prove that someone else caused that.
Is the DNR showing more initiative to get that area cleaned up, in your opinion? It seemed like wasn't happening, and then a lot of publicity came around and pressure was brought to bear, and it seems like there's more happening now.
Can you mentioned that area, can you just clarify what that area is?
Well, the area immediately around Waleco and that whole, like the railroad corridor and down into Riverside Park. It seemed like there's a reluctance to step in, but now that the Citizens for Clean Wausau and other groups have made a stink about it, they're more willing to step up and be more assertive.
Just to clarify that, the DNR doesn't have the option to be subjective when it comes to cleanup. They are held to cleanup standards, state statutes, that are very prescriptive when there's a contaminated site, what needs to be done. And then plans are submitted and then approved by DNR for cleanup. So the Waleco, and we're talking about two different sites. The Waleco site has been regulated by DNR for quite some time, and that cleanup is continuing through the groundwater and the remediation process. Now, the Riverside Park property, that's a new ERP site. So once the investigation was done and the contamination was found there, that site becomes a newly regulated site. So that's when DNR would step in for that parcel and go through the identification and cleanup process with that. So if there's extra attention, it may be because there's two new ERP sites in that, or one new ERP site with the Riverside Park, in the railroad corridor. So that could be why there's increased attention, I guess, if that's the term you used.
Okay, thank you for that.
So, wait, excuse
Go
me.
ahead, sure, no, go ahead.
So just to clarify, I am very comfortable with the DNR's efforts in getting both those sites cleaned up as prescribed by state law.
Alder Killian, you have your light on, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I may address a few of Mr. Fable's points. And yes, you had, after I flipped my light on, echoed what I was thinking about with the spills law, about it's either the causer or the owner of the property. Either way, somebody's going to get a responsible party letter, in my understanding. But back to the DNR ERP sites that I had brought up earlier, that's kind of a realm of expertise of mine, and I can tell you that what happened was not as rosy and optimistic as I heard in the last few minutes. I wish it had been, and that doesn't mean you knew it hadn't been, Mr. Fable, but I have a very detailed grasp of the history there. So what happened in Riverside Park was in 2006, due to a private lawsuit against Waleco and Sentry Insurance with allegations of cancer and endocrine problems on a wide scale on the southwest side, because the DNR had not required Waleco to ever take off-site soil samples. I'm not quite sure why, given their dioxin level was 174 parts per billion in the top foot of the soil, which was almost 3 times the levels of Dow Midland at the time, which is astounding. But so private tests were taken in Riverside Park in 2006. Ultimately, they were provided to the DNR and the city of Wausau in 2008. And at the time, a DHS toxicologist had recommended doing further testing, recommended to the DNR to make sure that this had not spilled over in a greater fashion to properties to the east, like park and homes and so forth. That was to the DNR, not the city of Wausau, that recommendation. But mysteriously, the recommendation was never followed. I had followed up with the DNR to inquire why that had occurred, and a couple of years ago, they dug around and they were unsure. But the city of Wausau possessed those results, which were pretty substantial levels, and unfortunately, they never disclosed it to the public, nor took much action other than trying to go out and locate the culvert where these levels had been identified. So unfortunately, it wasn't until about a decade later that citizens who had gone through court documents and so forth had come across those levels. That was after a decade of inaction from the city of Wausau, actually. And so I had asked Mr. Thompson at the DNR to run those through the RCL spreadsheet, which he did, and I have great respect for Mr. Thompson. And what it showed was that there were significant exceedances of state regulatory standards in that park where they had taken those samples. The demographic data there is quite evident because it's in the MPO's long-range transportation plan. It's available in the census data, and it's also available on EJ screen from the EPA. So to make a long story short, on Riverside Park, yes, advocacy is great, and the citizens did push and so forth to try to get some action there, and the Public Works Department had fought tooth and nail on that. You had a different position. You said testing wasn't required, and so did your consultant REI, I believe. The results just came up pretty bad, nevertheless. So that was kind of the story of Riverside Park, one of the open ERP sites. And then on 1300 Cleveland Avenue, which was part of the former Connor Forest Industries property, actually, when the city did its assessment in 1986, the city council had voted twice not to approve that property transaction because they were so worried that had such a notorious reputation. But then Connor finally gave us an indemnification agreement, and the council agreed we'll buy it if we're not on the hook. But in 1986, the city was aware of extensive residual contamination, which is in their notes up in the Public Works Department, but no action was taken until much later. And, in one of those records up in Public Works, it's in an envelope labeled confidential, but the city attorney's office told me it was not quote-unquote confidential. One of the employees had noted that they had talked to the neighborhood residents, and even though they didn't have formal wells at their homes because people were on city water, there were informal private wells in their yards and basements. Some people were even drinking out of them, and the city employee noted that it tasted and smelled like lacquer, and that was probably coming from Connor Forest Industries or the Crestline S&E property. Did the city do anything to alert the neighborhood? Not to my knowledge. Thank you.
Okay, additional questions for Kevin? Okay, Jim, go ahead.
So the city's not really capable of doing much because it's all a state DNR cleanup mandate. We can ask them or push them to do things, but we really can't do anything without we can't do anything at all. They have to do it, correct?
Correct. We don't have that jurisdiction.
So part of this resolution is probably not going to mean as much as we hope it's going to mean at a city level, except for maybe the part where it says support and deliver an equitable share of environmental benefits and community assets in all neighborhoods, et cetera, such as parks, open spaces and trees, which we have control of. I mean, it's hard to fathom that we can't clean up our own community without the state, with, you know, we need to do what we can to encourage the state to help us clean that up as much as we can.
And and we talk about equity, and that's one of the mechanisms in place to ensure equity, because when the state manages it, every brownfield in the state is managed the same way, versus one city managing it one way, another city managing it another way. So the fact that the state does manage it and the state does have the jurisdiction over that, that ensures a level of equity in how each brownfield site is treated.
Okay, thank you for that. Additional questions? Okay. Oh, Tom, go ahead.
Madam Chair, and I think Mr. Alder-Wodinski's questions were excellent about, you know, can we do anything independent of the state? We did have those results, and residents had requested for many years to do soil tests in Riverside Park, and the city ultimately did after getting an RP letter, I believe, kind of a twisted sequence of events there. But do you remember, was there any time that your department, Public Works and Engineering, was there any instance or occasion where, despite those soil samples showing exceedances of state regulatory standards in the neighborhood park, did your department recommend against doing further testing ever?
With the current results, which results are you speaking of?
I'm speaking of when this had gone through the Parks and Recreation Committee. Was there any occasion after we had had those results that were given to the city in 2008 where there had been requests, even after exceedances were shown, but the Public Works Department said that they recommended against doing any testing at that time?
I believe it was our recommendation that the DNR should dictate what additional tests should be done. And once again, going back to the process, once you identify an exceedance, that gets submitted to DNR, and then DNR dictates the level of testing to do after that. So I think it was a recommendation to let DNR dictate what tests would be required.
Thank you. I recall, I believe, that the recommendation was against doing further testing at the time. And this speaks to the environmental justice issue precisely, because it has sometimes more to do with just regulatory mandates than what we might consider kind of policy questions in terms of how we want to treat our community. And in this case, under this an environmental justice policy, we would never leave exceedances of soil dioxin contamination in a neighborhood park, whether the DNR required us to do more or not. We would do it because it was the right thing to do. And with advocacy, it's great that citizens do that, but I don't think it's the citizens' job to be the government. It is the government's job to be the government. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that I recall about that discussion, and this certainly isn't a resolution specifically about Riverside Park, so I don't want to get off too into the weeds about what we have there, but one of the recommendations that we had received from staff on that particular parcel when it came to council was that, not that we shouldn't conduct further testing, but that we should wait and see what the outcome was of tests that Waleco was required to make, right? I mean, so they had taken samples and their results were a couple months out. And I think we were asked to pause and see what that revealed first, partially because of the responsible party regulations that, you know, if their tests revealed that they were mandated to require, that they were also responsible for the contamination, then they also are responsible for the cleanup versus all of our taxpayers being responsible first. And so it wasn't a matter of not wanting to test, at least in the council chamber when we talked about it. I advocated to wait and see what we found from the private sector's tests first before we just jumped out and claimed the private sector's liability for them. And so, you know, that was a compelling discussion. We ultimately ended up agreeing to do more testing, paid for more testing. We did a robust series of samples. There's exceedances there. And ultimately, we are going to be saddled with payment of the cleanup, whatever standard that is. All of that was achieved without something like this. And I guess, I have some questions about the specificity of a resolution. We've all talked about resolutions before in that they are unenforceable, they carry no penalties, they have no teeth. We've been criticized out in public for overusing resolutions for exactly that reason. And so, the idea that you can pass a resolution for anything you want to pass one for, at the end of the day, the next week, the next month, what is any different? Because you've passed this resolution, which is essentially, 11 council members, if it passes council, saying, we aspire to this. And so my assertion is that being unenforceable, on its face, this doesn't make anything any better for people who need things to be better. And I guess that's my concern is, you can pass this language and everyone feels good about passing the language, but the real impact, there is no real impact because it's a resolution. There is nothing to enforce here. There's no fines, there's no penalties, there's nothing. At the end of the day, the DNR issues fines and the DNR compels cleanup. And so I feel like we would be better served to, as a city, engage with our citizens and advocates and we all should be aligned with the DNR and the EPA standards, and we all should be working together to hold private sector polluters accountable to the highest extent they can be. And I just don't see that we need something like this to make that happen. But, I have half of this resolution talks about creating a public engagement policy. Well, a public engagement, is it a public engagement policy or is it an environmental justice policy? Because we talk a lot, there's a lot of redundancy in here about public engagement. And right now we have all kinds of public engagement. We have neighborhood groups, we have public announcements, we have stakeholder meetings, we hold public information meetings, we host public hearings, we have open committee and council meetings where people can come and comment. We have public comment forms that are now available online since the new mayor came on. That was never available before. And so there is nothing that prevents people from coming and talking to us. And there's nothing that prevents anyone from going and talking to their individual alder or making a phone call down to City Hall and asking questions about their neighborhood. So I guess I question the need. Pat, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if we're following some kind of a game plan here, if we have more staff
Well,
consulting
we are, yes.
thing to do?
So, yep, we also have a memo from Director Lindman. And so if you don't have any additional questions for Mr. Fable, we'll bring up Director Lindman.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
I would
Sorry.
favor, finishing that up and then getting into the merits of
Okay.
whether we're going to jump on this.
do
or
that.
Just one.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Just one ending comment here. So just to address what Alderman Killian and Alderman Wadzinski were asking. So if there was a site, this resolution doesn't give the city any jurisdiction to enforce anything on a responsible party. As Alderman Killian said, the city can volunteer on their own dime to go do testing on properties they own. But the city has no jurisdiction to require another property owner to do testing on their property, nor does it have any jurisdiction over another property owner when it comes to environmental cleanup. That would all lie with DNR.
Jim?
Is the city restricted from doing the cleanup, which would be millions of dollars probably?
The city could always volunteer to clean someone else's property up. I mean, there's nothing stopping them, but the DNR would require whoever the responsible party is to do that. The city, there's nothing stopping the city from volunteering to do that.
I was talking about our own property. Would we clean it up, or would the DNR clean it up and we would just pay for it?
No, the DNR would dictate how we have to clean it up, or they would dictate the level it would have to be cleaned up to.
For city-owned property?
Correct. And then
Okay.
the city would figure out through
Right.
how to get that cleaned up, and the city would pay for that.
Thank you.
They would have no choice.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have questions for Kevin? If not, we'll bring up Director Lindman. Welcome, and you'd also provided comments to the committee. If you want to walk us through your comments?
Yeah, I can. Good evening.
Thank you.
I had read through the resolution and specifically the sections, basically sections 1 through 6, and trying to understand where the objectives are, where your priorities are, and trying to align that with what we're already doing or what, our municipal code and things like that requires us to do, as well as outside funding when we get it from the feds or the states, state municipal agreements, when we have HUD funding and we have to follow certain regulations, federal funding. So just from a staff perspective, I'm trying to understand how we can actually make changes based on how the resolution is written, right? So if there are areas where we fall short sometimes, if there are areas where that we can improve on communication, how we reach out to areas that we're doing projects in, what types of projects would initiate additional work on the planning side for us. Those are things that I felt were missing from here as far as just direction for us, to move forward. And so I don't know if, like I made some suggestions on whether we should maybe outline what we're doing already for the committee or the council to take a look at, and kind of where can we fill in some holes, where can we fill in some gaps, and to really make some tangible efforts, as we move forward with projects, and whether it's development or something on our local street projects, or other properties we're purchasing. Are there aspects that we need to do? So I guess that's a little bit what I tried to outline on this, is trying to figure out where the direction is to staff.
I guess where the question lies, and sometimes I think we're kind of backing into this a little bit, because sometimes a public policy document that we're asked to act on often is the result of a discussion like this. We often don't start with the item and then back into the discussion. So often we'll have an issue in the community that we talk about either in a committee or in a subcommittee, and then that results in a revelation that we need different policy, or we need a different ordinance, or we need different direction. And so then through a combination of legislative tools, we then will maybe change or create different public policy to address those deficiencies. So here, we kind of have the cart before the horse a little bit, because I feel like the discussion and the direction that you're asking for the staff to figure out, if we can communicate better, or if we can identify different guidelines for development or whatever. Some of that stuff is not only already happening, but I think it can happen in the absence of something like this. Often as a committee, as an example, the Economic Development Committee decided it wanted different standards for development agreements. And so that committee decided that they just wanted to go down a path of retooling how they do those things. But we didn't need to pass an aspirational resolution to do it. We just decided we wanted to do something different at the committee level. Same thing with communications. Often in CISM, we are mandated to have a public hearing, and the requirement says that you notify homeowners within 100 feet. Well, that's 3 houses. So we say to the staff, you will notify people within 2 blocks, and they do it. So I feel like, why can't we have those discussions without something like this? I mean, between our relevant committees and our advisory staff, I feel like if we are looking for improvements, the committees have the authority to improve processes without new public policy and without voting to do that. So, I don't know. I guess the other thing is, and when I'd asked our environmental engineer, Fable, about the processes with DNR, now since you've been the Public Works Director, you've had an awful lot of contact with the DNR for a number of these sites, most of them that are new, and for projects that we're currently managing in terms of development, things like 1300 Cleveland and the riverfront. And so have you found in your interactions with DNR and trying to work with all of these projects, is there deficiencies in their process?
I mean, other than slow, I haven't, but I do think, like, on the city side, our effort to communicate, I think, sometimes falls short. And, you know, to try to explain to people what is happening, when it's happening, how often it's happening, you know, so, and it happens with our projects as well, you know. So, like, when I read the resolution that was drafted and the public input, I see advantages there to take a look at how we're doing business and what we need to do and in ways that we can make that improvement. And it isn't, you know, just like putting out a press release or something like that. You know, it's like actually making contact with the neighborhoods, you know. And so, you know, as you talked, Lisa, about sometimes when we have public hearings, it says, hey, you need to notify the owners within 250 feet of this going on. You know, well, yeah, that's 3 houses. That's not, you know, that's not very impactful or requesting really comment. And so, so I think that there's some, I mean, I think that there's real validity into taking a look at how we're doing these things, and whether it's for environmental issues, whether it's just communication on projects, whether it's planning things that are going on, you know, and how we're communicating with the public in all areas of the city, you know, especially those areas where we're doing projects and development directly, you know, in those areas. And so, so, you know, I was trying to highlight some ideas, you know, whether it comes through a resolution and that moves forward, but how do we make it productive for change for us, you know, to move it forward. And so, so I think that there is some validity to have those discussions, you know, and moving forward. So that's just, you know, my 2 cents on some of this stuff.
But whether or not this item, I mean, regardless of the result of any vote on this item, those discussions could happen in earnest anyway, right? I mean, as far as.
Yeah, I think they can. I just think that, you know, those discussions, to have a resolution that would be productive moving forward would be good discussions to have.
Sure.
Yep.
Alder Killian.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the information, Mr. Lindman. I've just got a few questions about some things you had mentioned, and maybe we can build on those, and also some things your subordinate had mentioned earlier. You had been a technical participant in the long-range transportation plan, correct? You and Mr. Lenz, and they even let the mayors in there, right, to have some input on these things. Is that correct?
Sure. Yep.
And they have kind of an extensive section on environmental justice in here, and it's something the MPO apparently takes pretty seriously. It's under Chapter 9. And they identified or attempted to illustrate where environmental justice areas may be in Wausau using federal metrics, those being income and percentage of people of color in certain census blocks and so forth. And they came up with these 2 maps in the long-range plan, and they pretty much sync with the EPA data I've been talking about. They got their numbers right, I guess.
Okay.
And what's interesting is not only do they lay out the importance of environmental justice, what it is, where these segments are in town, then they go on to discuss them in relation to transportation projects in the future. And let me just perhaps give you an example. It says, quote, of the recommended transportation improvements listed in the 2016 to 2019 Transportation Improvement Program, the Thomas Street, Bridge Street, First Avenue, Town Line Avenue corridors in the city of Wausau, then it mentions some others outside of Wausau, all have the most direct impact on an identified EJ population. So, speaking to what was said earlier, I don't think that the MPO is suggesting this isn't a criminal indictment of any government involved in this. It's not suggesting criminal behavior. It's not a law and order drama thing about punitive sentences or what have you. So in terms of what was said about environmental justice earlier being punitive and meaning this and that, not only does that appear to be contradicted by federal and state agencies' records, it's also contradicted by the plan you were involved in participating in as a technical advisor. And I saw in a memo that there was some concern about how EJ screen was used, and heck, I don't know how you can slice and dice everything in there. It looks pretty neat. But there was some simplicity in the way that the MPO already identified kind of what may be EJ populations in the Wausau area. Which one, I think, because I heard your concerns and I read the memo, and I was thinking if the goal tonight is to be productive and to do something positive and address apparent challenges, one thing we could do is tie our data to what's already been done by the MPO, and not only would that be efficient, it would be cost effective because it's free. So we'd be dealing with the metrics and barometer that the MPO was already dealing with. So that would be one thing. And this is a resolution, but it does come with that action item of identifying on the GIS system these things that the MPO lays out in their packet. So that actually is an actionable item, and what that does then for policymakers like us, we would be able to see the data, and so would others, when we're making policy considerations. So that is the functionality of the resolution there. And then one last item right now would be, this is based on Evanston's resolution, and the thought process there was that the resolution would serve as a foundation for future policies and ordinances and so forth. And, Alder Wadinsky had asked about some of these things we can do. If we had a resolution serving as the foundation, now we've defined these areas of town and we're committed to ethical decisions, we could actually then have zoning policy changes where we say if there's an environmental justice population, it would be probably pretty precarious to allow expansion of industrial zoning. If we found, say, exceedances of dioxin contamination on our property exceeding state regulatory levels, which we did, then we would voluntarily, not because it's the regulatory mandate, but because it's the moral thing to do, we could say we're going to define the extent of that and address it. So this is meant to serve as a foundation, and I agree completely with you, Mr. Lindman, that we must re-inspect our processes because they have failed us environmentally for probably over 35 years. So I do not disagree with you there, and that is why it's even more important to do the definition like the MPO with which you were involved, and then to carry this and take some action, because at the end of the day, I think we can have some ethical mandates.
I think the one thing with the MPO is that the funding that they get mandates, what we do. And so part of that is, it's federal funding that comes through there for our infrastructure projects. And so part of the long-range plan is, they're required to do that. The LMI areas that you're showing in there, that's what's in our GIS system right now in the city. We track that in the census data and stuff. That stuff came from us, from our GIS system. So, we provide that to the MPO so they can incorporate that in their documents. So our GIS system already has the different census tracts, the LMI information in it.
Does it have the people of color statistics too?
I think it has some of that census data. I don't know to what extent, Tom, but we could definitely dive into that. I know GIS over the last several years since I've been here has been working to, get that as robust as possible.
If we had both, that would do the trick here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't that the same GIS data that we use to determine how we will deploy community development block grant money when it comes time to offset assessments for street and road projects?
It is, yeah, and where we use the CDBG funds.
Right.
Yep, within those tracks as well. Yeah.
And historically, we've been really very proactive in using those funds to offset either in part or completely the cost of street and sidewalk and utility repairs for low to moderate income neighborhoods.
Right.
So that's, I mean, the fact that that's already in play is a big positive. Mayor?
I don't have a question for Mr. Lindman, but it felt natural to maybe share some of the comments that I had. So I don't know if there are more questions for Mr. Lindman, I would.
Let's defer for a second. Does anyone else in the committee have questions for Director Lindman? Go ahead, Jim.
You said the GIS standards might not have all the information regarding to ethnicity or race of people. Does that really matter? Can't we just treat everybody the same?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, Tom might be looking for, something a little bit more broader and detailed and things like that. And I just don't know to what extent how they have that broken down in our system, so.
Yes, because it was very important to the city of Wausau when it was monetizing the Hmong community in 2012 to bootstrap them to get federal funds. So if we're going to do that, and you've got some sample of that in front of you, I printed out a few pages. So apparently it's important to someone, and it is important to me, that there's not a disproportionate burden. And one reason it matters, Alder Wadinsky, is because, as pointed out in the city's EPA application, there were certain cultural practices which still exist, including gardening around former industrial sites and certain fishing practices and consumption, leading to disparate PCB risk and so forth. So we are, in a way, yes, looking out for everybody, but we realize that there are some unique aspects that put people at risk, and that was my interest in that. Thank you.
Got it.
Okay. With that, Mayor, go ahead with your questions, and then I have a couple questions about specific provisions in the document, so.
Sure. So I just want to say I talked to Council President Becky McElhaney. She couldn't be here today because of some important stuff she's doing with her family. So I think this is a really good opportunity for us to talk about our strategies and our practices when it comes to the development opportunities that lie ahead. And I want to share some of Becky McElhaney's comments because we're pretty aligned, and I also said that I would. So here's what she said, and I'm reading verbatim here. So she says, I understand factories and manufacturers were located within our city and riverfront where neighborhoods were both in proximity and grew around those job-producing employers. The environmental records of many were poor and some worse than poor, causing contamination that remains today. We cannot undo the past, but we can only clean up the contamination when found. I believe our city should prioritize ensuring all our residents enjoy a clean, healthy environment. During our discussion of building a new water and upgrades to our sewer plants, I stated local government has a duty to provide our residents clean water and safe removal of wastewater. To that end, we also need to do everything we can to ensure the air and soil and the air we breathe and touch every day is safe for generations to come. All decisions we make should have these priorities in mind. So again, those are President McElhaney's comments, but I think she's exactly right on. So after hearing from Alder Killian, I had a chance to do a little bit of digging before this meeting, a very little bit, but I talked to Andy Lynch, who works as the transportation planner for Marathon County and the Metropolitan Planning Organization. And he knows that I'm going to mention him, so if you have questions, we can dig him up too. But as part of the long-range planning with the MPO, they actually do use the federal environmental justice tool to look at the affected neighborhoods. He said that while these are standard inclusions in the long-range plan, there hasn't traditionally been a lot of discussion about them in that making of the plan. He also gave me the federal highway definition of environmental justice, which I think is probably similar to the one that you have before you. I'm going to read it just so that we're all kind of level set on what environmental justice is, because we had a couple of questions. But environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, income, national origin, or educational level, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. For the purpose of this strategy, fair treatment means that no population, due to policy or economic disempowerment, is forced to bear a disproportionate burden of the negative human health and environmental impacts, including social and economic effects, resulting from transportation decisions, programs, and policies made, implemented, and enforced at the federal, state, local, or tribal level. So I think maybe what's more interesting about all of this, at least in my opinion, is that environmental justice will likely be a part of the bigger infrastructure discussion that's moving forward right now. Pete Buttigieg, who's the secretary of the DOT right now, has been talking about it as a main tenet of the DOT strategies. And that big infrastructure package that could be headed our way will likely include those EJ principles. So that means that right now is exactly the right time for us to be talking about this. It's perfect timing. I think the place for the discussion of the past, we have the opportunity to consider these forward-thinking policies that will help get us get a good handle on what our community needs. So I think step one is understanding what Alder Killian calls the environmental justice areas and what others are calling the LMI areas, kind of similar. So if we want to have more engagement with the communities we serve, we need to understand what the barriers to participation are. Are there language barriers, timing problems with public hearings or meetings? Do people need babysitters? I hear other cities talking about this. What can we do to engage more people? So I think that's the policy question, at least one of them that this body should consider. And additionally, when we talk about impacts, that's something that Andy Lynch and I talked about. Impact can be both positive and negative. I think Alder Killian has noted that his goal is to not do more harm, which is a good goal. So when we have more input from the communities we serve, I think we can do even better than that. We can help them build a healthier future. So lastly, I'm almost done here. I think it's super important to position Wausau as a place the federal government should actually invest their infrastructure dollars in. The federal government is signaling that they want to help communities make lasting investments in infrastructure, and that includes infrastructure projects that, quote, create good paying jobs, boost the economy, ensure equity, and tackle our climate crisis. So that's what the Public Health and Safety Committee can help us with today. How do we position Wausau as a place for families to grow? How do we ensure we're engaging the community in a productive way? How can we be ready and responsive to the changing expectations from state and federal government? And, you know, the concept of environmental justice can help us build bridges in our community, literal and figurative, and position us as a competitive investment for the future. So this is really big. How do we use this to get at our broad shared goals? That's making sure that everyone in Wausau, regardless of the neighborhood they live in, has the opportunity and access to a healthy life and future in Wausau.
Thank you for that. Have, in any of your interaction with federal funding sources, either with American Rescue Plan or with the pending infrastructure bill, have you or any staff people had seen any requirement that to participate in any of those funding mechanisms that we are required to pass an EJ policy?
Not to pass an EJ policy, but those principles likely in the infrastructure bill and language that we're seeing, they're talking about those principles. So it's going to be something we'll talk about or just be forced to kind of adhere to. So
But we're
I
not
think
required to have one to be eligible?
no.
Okay, I was going to say, I hope not, because most communities haven't gone down this road.
No,
And-
we're one of the first.
Well, first, exactly. And so with that, I have a couple of questions about the specific document. I guess I'm going to ask you, Alder Killian, as the author of the document. I'm on the first page at the end, the last whereas clause that says, the city of Wausau seeks to support the delivery of an equitable share of environmental benefits and community assets in all neighborhoods and wards that enhance quality of life, parks, open spaces, and goes on to talk about infrastructure investments. What is the practical application of that? I mean, what does it mean? That we're going to, I mean, we already, in the SISM committee, we already have worked on spreading out our street and road projects so that all districts can feel that help is coming on our infrastructure backlog versus devoting and isolating all of those projects in one specific district. So what does this mean? I mean, I guess what are we not doing today that this addresses?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for your questions. And I take it when you're asking them, you're referring to kind of the assets and benefits portion in terms of making sure that
Well, I guess what assets? Because we have parks in a lot of neighborhoods. We have green space reserved in our developments that developers have to provide green space or pay in lieu of. And we have worked hard to make sure that we're addressing infrastructure needs in a multitude of different districts versus, you know, for a while it seemed like all of our projects, sorry, Pat, were in District 1 because they were all kind of co-located and it made sense when you had one street open to do 3 or 4 more. But you know, we, last year as a committee, decided to spread that around because everyone's district has bad roads. We tried to get the worst of the worst first, and we've done that again this year. So what assets are we not spreading around now, I guess?
Sure, and I take it I'll have the time to answer this in
Certainly.
full.
Well,
Good. Then I
I'm
won't start.
interested in what we don't do now, so.
Sure, and I think if we were going to get into inventorying all of those things, we'd probably need a day conference, but I'll take a few minutes right now to just cover some of the history. And it also plays into what you had asked the mayor about with some of these funds, and do we have to do this and that to get the funds? Well, I'm going to start off with an example in 2012 when Mayor Tipple received 2 letters in a bundle, and one was from WIS-DOT and one was from the Federal Highway Administration. Now, what was interesting, it notified the city of violating federal guidelines along Thomas Street in the early real estate acquisition process, but I think a lot of people, they read it in the newspaper. We knew it was kind of disgraceful, but not a lot of people saw those letters from the feds and the state. So in both of those letters on the front page, they list environmental justice because it's not just about contamination. I think the mayor and some others had brought up with housing and transportation, it plays a role. Well, it had notified the city that it already thought that irreversible adverse impacts had occurred to low-income and minority segments through the early real estate acquisition process in the context of environmental justice. So that was just one of many things that were listed there as a grievance, and of course the city was put on a blacklist, and I think they wanted to mandate, yes, it was a watch list, it certainly
Right,
was.
but I wouldn't say a blacklist, and they were able to secure similar funding for other projects adjacent to Thomas Street, so let's be accurate, but okay.
I'm
familiar with the letters, though, so okay.
And I'm entirely accurate. I'm not known for being too flowery. I'm kind of robotic. So that is completely accurate. It was put on a watch list. And that is one example that had we been doing with locally funded things, what we might have been doing had we actually been touching federal or state money, had we been following these best practices, that portion of it likely would not have been in that letter. Secondly, we talk about environmental assets and benefits, and those are really just fancy terms for things in our environment and nature that provide benefits to the communities. And as you mentioned, that includes things like parks and green spaces and so forth. So what we've seen, and I think assets is a great example. So parks, I'm not aware of any other park in the city of Wausau that had had serious soil dioxin contamination sitting in it with the city's awareness since 2008 without any effort to do delineation or remediation. I'm not aware of anything like that. And when we look at the East River front, and I'm glad you brought this up, Alder Rasmussen, what I have in front of me is the EPA application from 2012, the Brownfield application. And so it actually is a 47-page contradiction of many of the things that were stated tonight. And it goes into detail about the most needy tract, that census tract in my district, with unemployment, income, minority populations, persons with disabilities, and it essentially not just monetize the southwest side, but the Hmong community and so forth to get federal funds. Now it mentions in here a whole slew of things that it was going to do to help those segments that helped it get this money. I'm not aware that ever really occurred. It did clean up land on the East River front. I'm glad about that regardless. That's positive. But I'm not sure it actually did do the things it said it would to help these segments that help it got this federal money. And even with the current proposal on the riverfront, there's been a lot of concern and debate about, with this high-end development, how much of the riverfront is it going to cannibalize? In earlier proposals and grants, and you've pointed this out, and I agreed with you, it was meant to be an open public space. And what we've done is use TIF money, federal money, a lot of public money to essentially subsidize and build things that most people in the city cannot really afford. So I could go on, but that would be a few examples of how, with assets and benefits, they're not equally maintained or distributed.
Okay, so I get the gist of that. The other thing I was reading is it says here on the next page at the top, the city of Wausau seeks to foster equity, community engagement, environmental sustainability, and community cohesion, and transparent decision-making. And what I highlighted with a question was, the city of Wausau aspires to engage all Wausau residents equally, regardless of income, race, ethnicity, language, age, gender, sexual orientation, ability, immigration status, and address for equal access to information. How is the public right now being discriminated against by address? I can't imagine that we would intentionally not notify or not interact with people based on their address or based on who they are or where they live. I mean, we've provided all kinds of opportunities for the public to engage with our decision-making. We didn't intentionally leave out those people.
Are you, when you refer to address, are you essentially indicating location?
Well, your resolution says address, and I guess I'm confused by, is there some assertion made here that we have excluded people based on address in having access to the decisions of their government? I don't feel that we have.
I feel that we have.
Okay.
And yes, I mean, even today, like, this was important. We're entertaining a resolution about public participation. This isn't particular to address. We can talk about that at length more if you'd like. But even the meeting packet for this resolution to have a better participation process was not put on the city calendar until nearly noon today. And it was in another spot by the minutes and agendas, but I had multiple citizens contact me and said, why isn't this on there? I can't find it. And so, not everything is going to be epic, but if you work with me, we can make adjustments and improvements to our public participation processes. And I'll give you just a last brief anecdote about the Thomas Street project. We know the demographics there and the location. I went to multiple meetings. It might have been around 2010 or so. I don't remember. I think it was when Alder Brzezinski was chair of one of the committees, so I don't know what year that goes back to. But in this very important process where people were potentially losing their homes, at least 2 subsequent meetings, they were not allowed to speak at that time. And you can say, well, the past is the past, but also in my open records request, I've even noted and respectfully from you on multiple occasions not to put public participation on the agenda. Now, I know it's at discretion of the chair and you usually allow it, but I don't think it should be at the discretion of the chair. I believe it should be at the discretion of the people.
Okay. Well, so I guess I'm not going to delve into a discussion of that. Obviously, we always allow public comment. We've allowed over an hour of it tonight. And so, that said, we obviously want to engage with the public in all of our decision-making. And whether or not a public comment segment exists in a meeting at the top or bottom of the agenda, it is at the discretion of the chair to accept public comment, and we always accept it from people who want to make comments. So, I guess here's one concern that I have. And so I guess when I looked at this, I started to read this and think, okay, what is our end game here? Like, what is the ultimate result of this action? And so when I got to kind of towards the tail end of it under section 2, where it says that this resolution establishes Wausau's definition for environmental justice, it also goes on to say that this serves as the foundation for the future development of ordinances to ensure active consideration of environmental justice and meaningful public participation, city practices, decision-making, whatever. So public engagement isn't really, I mean, we can all agree that we want public input and we want public engagement. So, but when I skip down to section 4, the city of Wausau will incorporate environmental justice into city of Wausau ordinances, codes, policies, and processes, which could include a review of existing codes, which will be conducted with appropriate revisions to bolster and improve environmental justice outcomes. And so the concern I have is that this is step 1 to a series of future public policy changes that could essentially drive up the cost of construction in this community. So if we want to change, let's say we change building codes, or we change design standards, or we change construction ordinances. And the incorporation of these principles, by and large, makes those methods or materials more expensive. So if the outcome of that is that construction in the city of Wausau suddenly, as a result of some of the adoption of these future policies, costs 25 to 30% more than it costs in Rib Mountain or Weston or Schofield, where is new development going to go? And at what point do we draw the line? Where does the impact of this meet existing property owners? So if somebody wants to modify their home or their business or build a new one, is there any, do these future policies come with grandfather clauses? Or is everybody held to a different set of standards that incorporate these principles and then drive up the cost of the project to the point where it's cost prohibitive for people to do them? And so I kind of am starting to see the writing on the wall here that some of these changes, if they start to follow and kick off a cascade effect of, new regulatory ordinances, that could be a serious detriment to growth if people seek out other communities that don't have these things on their books. And then at that point, how do we grow as a community? How do we generate new tax base? How do we attract new residents and new businesses if we are, systematically changing the requirements under the guise of environmental justice to drive up the core cost? I just see a string of future actions that this is going to touch off. So go ahead.
Thank you. And were you seeking my input on those comments?
Well, that's my concern. That's what I see. That's what I see
yeah.
coming.
I can completely relieve your concern because I think we've jumped the shark a little bit. I don't know where these hypothetical cost increases are coming from. Usually, so environmental justice, if we were doing things under state or federal money, often we'd be doing these things anyway. And so, no, I don't think we've seen the type of incremental increase that you're describing. I don't even know what that would be. And these things wouldn't be done under the guise of environmental justice. They would be done because of environmental justice. And there was a great white paper written by the New School on municipal environmental justice policy in the last year or two. It's online, everyone can read it. And it gave some examples of how these were turned into policy. And this would be extending what Mr. Lindman desired, because I agree with him and I thank him for, if he doesn't know how things could be improved, I thank him for asking. So with those municipal policies, it would include things like zoning. So we'd certainly perhaps revisit some zoning issues. And right now, spot zoning itself tends to be a no-no, but we may want to look at, as you've said in past economic development meetings, making sure that there isn't industrial expansion in areas that have already borne a disproportionate burden. I think Riverside Park's a perfect example too of, we would want to put some protections in place to make sure we were doing the right thing. And right, left, and center, I talk to people. I'm not a partisan. Elephant, donkey, elephonky means nothing to me. Humans matter. And I would tell you that across the board, what happened in Riverside Park, no one agreed with that on the ground because they thought it was our property, we had a problem, and citizens had to beg and fight for years. So we would want to come up with some policy. And yeah, sometimes it's expensive to be negligent, and I think we were. But money regardless, we would come up with policies if there was contamination on our property. Even if the state DNR wasn't mandating it, we would at least do the moral thing and look into it. And I think we would want to use non-industrial residual contaminant levels from the DNR in residential neighborhoods to make sure we were cleaning up to the most rigorous standards for people's health. So I don't think that this would at all, bring us to some sort of economic apocalypse. What it would do is improve our reputation with the public, and it would safeguard their health and environment.
Okay, but what I take from that also is that then by that principle, you'd also be seeking to essentially compel the city to undertake expensive cleanup on the taxpayer's dime. And, you know, that, depending on what the future land use is, if there even is one, that has a big impact for Wausau's taxpayers, because ultimately, responsible parties need to be held accountable for this stuff. Taxpayers, by and large, did not put the pollution in the ground. They didn't seek to keep it there. And at the end of the day, accountability for the responsible parties that put it there or their successors really is the key. But if we are going to just do the moral thing and we're going to automatically, as a result of something like this, make investments to clean things up to a non-industrial standard, which is way more expensive, you know, I think we just reworked our zoning code. And I think all of these discussions, if we want better communication, if we want to, you know, make sure that we have properties properly zoned, that's what we have committees for. It's what we have a plan commission for. And I think at the end of the day, we can have all of these discussions in the absence of a resolution like this. If we want to communicate better, we communicate better. We can make that decision as a governing body. If we get, and we found before with other issues, if you get people around a table who care about an issue, good things can happen. And you don't need to pass public policy first and then back into what the problem is so that people understand it. If we want to do anything better, we can resolve as a governing body to do those things within the tools that we already have. So, you know, like when our environmental engineer, Kevin Fable, came up and said, we have the tools to do these things. The DNR mandates how we're going to do it, when we're going to do it. They mandate how the private sector is going to do it and to what standard and when. If those tools already exist, I feel like we're creating a redundancy here. And, you know, we've been accused by a number of our citizens as overusing resolutions to communicate. We don't need to pass a resolution to have every conversation. We just don't. And I feel like we are, I guess, creating, you know, or ready to pass a document here, and whether it passes here or not, or whether it passes council or not, where's the impact? Because this on its face, I go back to my statement, changes nothing for anybody. The people in the census tracts that we're concerned about, we have, and it's not just District 3, it's not. There have been environmental issues identified in almost every district, with the exception of some that are newer subdivisions. There have been issues there's an issue in District 7 right now. I don't know if anybody knows it, but underneath the parking lot at Marathon Electric is a former city dump from the 1930s. And if we ever have to redevelop the Marathon Electric property, we're going to have huge problems with that. And I will absolutely, on behalf of my residents, work towards a solution, but I'm certainly not going to complain about the city's decisions from 75 years ago when I do that. And that really is something that pains me, is that we have spent 2 hours tonight adjudicating old history and administrations that none of us are part of. And where does this get us at the end of the day? That's what this committee has to sort out, is, are we, as a community, are we doing a better job for anybody the day after this passes? That's what I want us to ask ourselves. So, you know, that's just my 2 cents. Pat, you've got your light on? Go ahead.
Thank you. As you just pointed out, Madam Chair, we are at the 2-hour mark, and I believe that there are a number of people in the room, in addition to myself, that would appreciate a 5-minute break. So I wonder if we could do that.
Yep, if you'd like,
and then
absolutely.
come
We
back to the
can
discussion.
take a 5-minute recess, and we'll come back and finish up our discussion and then carry out the rest of our agenda.